Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And TSCA is an historic achievement. We all came together. We all stood together to produce that historic environmental bill. And I look forward to the day where we all stand together on climate science and stand together on the new energy policy for the future, and hope that that day may be arriving in the near future, perhaps after a Supreme Court decision on the Clean Power Plan. But my ability to prognosticate the future is more limited than my ability to talk about the past and the proud past that we just had yesterday.
Well, yeah, and let me just interrupt for a moment here and say that Senator Whitehouse in his time this afternoon was talking about what one of our colleagues said 30 years ago, and I was thinking to myself, it was 7 years ago that Al Gore said that there'd be no more ice on the North Cap in 5 years. I can remember on my other committee that I had, in the Armed Services Committee, it was 20 years ago, because I was sitting there when they said, in 10 years, we will no longer need ground troops. So I think it's better to kind of look into the future and evaluate the present.
I agree with you. Predicting the future is a very perilous terrain for politicians. Okay? We work towards creating the future without knowing exactly how it's going to play out. And how the Supreme Court acts is obviously something in the future. In 2007, in the most important environmental decision that has ever been decided, Massachusetts versus the EPA, it was a 5-4 decision, which, by the way, makes the case for not having a 4-4 Supreme Court. Otherwise, perhaps we would not have had a 5-4 decision. But Justice Kennedy voted in the majority, 5. So that's where we're going to be today, predicting the future, where these justices are going to be, and even who will be on the Supreme Court. We don't even quite know that when, when that case might be argued. So, as Yogi Berra used to say, making predictions is a very hard thing to do, especially about the future. So my view is that we should just look at the case as it sits before us and just look back a little bit in time, because many of the complaints that come from members about the impact on the coal industry, well, in the Waxman-Markey bill, we built in $200 billion for carbon capture and sequestration. We built in billions of dollars for coal miners if they needed it. That is, if carbon capture and sequestration was not possible. We built all that money in, $200 billion. You know what Peabody Coal said? You know what Alpha Coal said? You know what Arch Coal said? They said, no, we don't want it. That was the money that could have been there for carbon capture and sequestration. They said no. The Edison Electric Institute endorsed Waxman-Markey, but the coal industry exercised their veto power in the Senate, rejecting $200 billion for carbon capture and sequestration, rejecting the money for the coal miners. So as we hear today, the concern about the coal miners, just remember that. It was Peabody Coal that made that decision. All of their stocks, of course, now down in single digits or lower, kind of negative. But that's a little bit of history. Just want to say that it was an attempt to solve this issue, work together on that issue in a way that dealt with all of the interests, all of the parties. It wasn't going to be all or nothing, 100% versus 0. It was going to be something that tried to deal with the legitimate need to create a bridge for each and every technology to make it to this cleaner energy future. But it was Peabody Coal that said no. And it's Peabody Coal that's funding the brief in the Supreme Court. Peabody Coal funding the brief in the Supreme Court. Just remember that. Same company, same interest, same money, same short-term perspective. So that's what we're talking about. Okay? And nothing, to use one of my father's terms, nothing frosts me more than having these very same people still arguing that it can't be done and we can't make the transition, even as we're going to have 16,000 new megawatts of solar and 9,000 new megawatts of wind installed in the United States this year. It's going to be the vast majority of all new electricity in the country. But we weren't leaving coal behind. I just want to say that. Carbon capture and sequestration is a technology that could have been invested in by public monies that Peabody Coal said they did not want. So I just don't want to hear the crocodile tears from Peabody Coal and Arch Coal and Alpha Coal. So, Professor Rivez, the stay issued by the Supreme Court does not prohibit the EPA from working on activities related to the Clean Power Plan. It only prohibits it from enforcing the requirements. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator.
Yeah, so thank you. Now, during the stay, the EPA is allowed to issue guidance and tools to help states that have decided to continue their plans. Is that correct?
That is also correct, and it's also been the practice of administrations of both parties in the 3 last presidential administrations when stays like this were issued.
Yeah, and critics have accused the EPA that by not announcing the effects the stay will have on all of the compliant states, forces states to continue work towards the Clean Power Plan, using time and resources towards a rule that may be overturned. However, whether or not to change the compliance deadlines and by how much has traditionally been decided on a case-by-case basis and not issued until the ruling. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's always been issued when the stay was lifted at the end of the litigation.
Yeah. So from my perspective, the EPA has been very flexible in its dealings with the states. I know that there are some states that perhaps don't like this idea. I'm sure there were many, many states that weren't happy with Brown versus Board of Education. Might have even been 31 states that were unhappy with Brown versus Board of Education. And they would have sued to overturn it if they could get away with it. And I'm sure there's many other decisions in history that 31 states might have sued to say, we don't want to move to the future. We don't want to change the way in which we do business. But it doesn't mean that that case is going to get overturned in the Supreme Court. It doesn't mean that enough justices aren't going to come together to look at the accuracy of the argument being made by the administration that they're upholding existing law and acting under existing law. That is what the Supreme Court did in 1954. That is what this court also will have to decide. And I just think it's premature and not a good use of our time to be projecting what the Supreme Court is actually going to decide. This is just a discussion of the law. And I think that the law, as it's being interpreted by the administration, is right on the money. And so, Professor, I'm just going to give you a final minute. Just tell us how we should be viewing this issue now going forward over the next year. What's the perspective that we should have, in your opinion, in viewing this historic case as it moves to the Supreme Court?
Thank you, Senator. I think we should understand that there is a lot of strength in the administration's position, that the arguments that EPA is using unprecedented regulatory techniques, so for example, that the rule is assuming there'll be some fuel shifting going on, or that the rule is imposing certain obligations that a plant cannot meet within the 4 walls of its plant. That all of those techniques have been used in the past, not only by Democratic administrations, but also by Republican administrations. They're part and parcel of all of these efforts that Senator Carper referenced concerning the effort to control interstate emissions. Those are all the standard toolkit of EPA. There's another big argument about why EPA shouldn't be able to regulate the greenhouse gas emissions of power plants under Section 111D because it's regulating the hazardous emissions of power plants under Section 112. What EPA is doing in this case is essentially consistent with the approaches of administrations of both parties going back to 1990, going back to 25 years. And on the constitutional side, Professor Tribe was mentioned several times. He made 3 arguments very forcefully at a House hearing. I was a Democratic witness at that hearing. Two of those arguments aren't even being made anymore by the opponents of the Clean Power Plan.
Okay, we're going to have to cut this off. I'd like to say, Senator Markey, and they'll all be glad to know that we have just been saved by the bell. There is a vote that's underway, and
30 seconds.
You've already 30 seconds, and that's it. And then then I've got an idea. Go ahead.
Okay, good, and I look forward to that.
See, if you guys don't know out there, we really like each other.
We are good friends. We're good friends.
Yeah, really, and he has every right to be wrong.
You know what my father used to say? If two people agree upon absolutely everything, then you don't need one of those people. So we need each other on climate science. We need each other to have this debate. So again, Waxman Markey, EEI endorsed it, General Electric, DuPont, Applied Materials, Timberland, Dow Corning, Alcoa, Johnson & Johnson. We had this broad base of support. General Motors, Chrysler, all the auto industry, they all endorsed Waxman Markey. Okay? The outlier was the coal industry, the people paying for this brief before the Supreme Court, Peabody Coal. It's the same culprit. It's the same rearview mirror, a look at history, and we were trying to give them a bridge to the future so they did not have to go into bankruptcy. Do you think they wish they could go back to 2009 again and grab that money? You know they would, okay? They made a big historic mistake. The Supreme Court will not make an
Thank you,
historic
Senator
mistake.
Markey. Now I'm going to take the chair.